Hello everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. So we continue this very long section on the misdeeds by focusing on these sentences today. The first is the misdeed of squandering someone else's property. So if we break down these various characters, this idea of squandering actually has different meanings, and it's elaborated in the collected commentaries to the Exalted Treatise. So one meaning is to cheat or to scam someone, particularly the ignorant, the elderly, the uninformed, of their possessions and their wealth. So that's the first idea. The second idea is to lead others or entice others to engage in various activities such as gambling, gaming, etc., that would then, consume and squander and waste away their wealth and their property. So why would someone do this? Obviously, this is, enticing someone or leading someone into these habits is really to one's own profit. That person is thinking of themselves. And so there's a very, very dramatic story in the collected commentaries. And it talks about a particular man called Xu Shi, who was quite wealthy himself. And he had a friend who obviously had a very nice house, and he was quite jealous and he wanted this particular property. But noting, of course, that he himself had a sizable fortune himself. So what did he do in order to be able to attain this property? Well, he came up with a various sort of very cunning idea, which was to sort of lead his friend's son to sort of ways in which would squander the family's fortunes. So sort of led him to gambling, prostitution, etc. And so very quickly, this child, this son of his friend, accumulated a lot of debts. And as a result, his friend had to sell off his possessions, consumed the family fortune, and ultimately had to sell his property at a low price, in a way it was an emergency sale, you could say. And therefore, Xu Shi ultimately came into possession of this property. Shortly after, his own two sons and their grandchildren develop a very strange illness, and it's not something that can be treated by any doctor. You can imagine he's trying to see as many different medical practitioners as he can, anyone that will provide some sort of cure, but it's a very strange condition. And so after exhausting the conventional doctors, he goes and sort of consults these spiritual doctors, shamans, people who could communicate with the spirits. And this particular shaman tells him that actually this illness is because of someone that you've wronged in the past. This person wants to seek revenge because you took their property. And Xu Shi, who's doesn't give up, he's thinking, well, okay, is there a way that I can employ some Taoist masters? In those days, there were Taoist temples, and these Taoist masters could also communicate with the spirits. And so he tries to seek the help of these Taoist masters, thinking that they could help, but actually, ultimately, they can't, because they tell him that this particular spirit of his friend who has been wronged has made his case to the the spirit world, and they have meted out this particular punishment to him and his family. And shortly after, Xu Shi actually passes away, as well as his family. So that's a very dramatic example of the consequences of this particular misdeed, and it's very clear, isn't it? This person could say that from a legal perspective, they didn't do anything wrong. They simply sort of encouraged the son to develop bad habits, but actually his intention was to gain that property, to squander away his friend's fortune, so much so that they would have to sell that property. And it essentially became destitute, and his friend ultimately passed away. So quite clearly there's this cause and effect. This is what he's done, and the consequence is very immediate, and also it's very dramatic. So you can see the misdeed and its consequence. I guess for many of us, when we see this kind of dramatic example, you might say, well, it's not something that we would do. And Venerable Master in his lectures sort of turns it around and tries to explain this particular sentence in a way that is relevant to all of us. We may not be so cunning and manipulative as Xu Shi, but on an everyday perspective, it's also about developing sustainable habits, not wasting the resources that we have currently. And he sort of brings it, so Venerable Master brings it back to this principle of cause and effect, otherwise known as divine retribution. The principle, which very clearly stated by the Ming Dynasty scholar Liao Fan, when he says that everything that we have, up to every bite of food that we have, every sip of drink that we have, the food and the drink that we have is destined. But everything that we currently have is destined. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's been predetermined. But the question is, predetermined by who? And according to the Taoist belief, but also even the Confucian and Buddhist traditions, it's not predetermined by any particular higher being or supreme being. It's actually predetermined by ourselves. So all the good fortune that we enjoy and all the misfortune that we encounter has been predetermined by ourselves. Now, when I talk about good fortune, people often think of, I guess, winning the lottery, wealth, great fame. But I think that actually the good fortune is something that is much more everyday and ordinary. So any sort of favorable condition that we encounter, if we have a good friendly relationship with someone, that in itself is good fortune. If we have some sort of success in our daily work, our projects, a successful career, then that is also good fortune. And even our health, the fact that we are able to look after ourselves, we do not have any debilitating sort of acute or chronic conditions, that is also good fortune. So everything that we have, all our possessions, everything that we've achieved in our career, in our work, in our study, as well as the relationships that we have that are loving, that are harmonious, and they nourish us. All of these can be classed as our good fortune, these favorable conditions. Let alone, something like achieving great wealth or fame and other kinds of good fortune. So When we say that all of this is predetermined, then it sort of makes us realize that we have a hand in all of the things that happen to us, including our wealth, our, our possessions, our belongings, our relationships. And I want to use a very simple analogy to really think this through. And it's the analogy of savings in a bank. And so I'm sure many of us have had the life experience of managing our finances and trying to, save some money towards something that we want to buy, etc., and growing our savings. So the balance that we see in our accounts, in our savings accounts, that is not something that happened today, but that balance, that the savings that we have were accumulated from the past, from yesterday and the days before. So this is similar to our good fortune, that everything that we experience now is not something that is the result of what we've done just now, but actually something that we've done in the past. And from the Buddhist tradition, things that have happened in previous lifetimes. And this savings, so to speak, from the idea of good fortune and misfortune is not in monetary terms, but is in terms of merits. Okay, so we have merits and demerits. Merits is positive, demerits means red in terms of our savings. So we accumulate merits by according with the Tao and these good deeds, which was, the very first part of the Exalted Treatise. And most of this, if you boil it down, is really the good deed and the good merit of thinking of others over and above oneself. Whereas we incur losses or demerits if we think only of ourselves. Okay, so if we come back to this sentence that is before us, this so-called misdeed of squandering someone else's property, and the story of Shu, yes, he was able to achieve the house that he wanted, like this grand house that he was very jealous of his friend of having. And in the short term, we may think that this person has achieved some good fortune. He's gotten this house at a very cheap price, for example. But that was the result of merits that he accumulated in the past. Now, because of his cunning method and his ill will towards his friend, and ruining his friend's family and fortunes, he's actually accumulated a huge demerit. So not only has he, used up his good fortune by actually gaining that house, he's not able to enjoy any of it and very quickly suffers the consequences of his family's illness and therefore having to use up his money to see doctors, etc., and travel to see doctors and different Taoist practitioners, etc. He very quickly has to use up and squander his own fortune because he's incurred such a huge demerit and losses based on his misdeed. So the losses outweigh the benefits that are really just short term. You think that you've gained something, but actually that gain is because of what you've already done in the past, but you've used that up in the process because of the demerits that you've accumulated. And the demerit is proportional to the damage that you inflict. So it's not just about, the cost of the property, it's the cost to the lives of that family, the lives of the son, his father, parents, etc., and much more. And so you can see that the cause and the effect are equal. So ultimately, you can see that the costs of the demerits outweigh so-called short-term benefits. And that's how we see billionaires, the people who are, entrepreneurs, for example, in a matter of years, sometimes they can turn bankrupt and even sort of be imprisoned because of their fraudulent activity. So how they've accumulated their wealth at the time they became billionaires, millionaires, but they've quickly used up their good fortune that they've from their earlier merits, and incurred losses through their misdeeds, so much so that in a matter of years, it's all used up. So these ill-gotten gains cannot be enjoyed. So if you try to squander someone's property and take someone else's property, then you just incur your own suffering. It leads to your own suffering and your own misfortune. There's also a very interesting story from the collected commentaries, and it's about a scholar by the name of Ding Shi. And what happens, as he's about to, as he's studying for the exams, is that he meets a fortune teller. Now, in those days, when you read these stories, you think about how many people had this particular skill. Fortune telling could be through, reading palms. It could be through calculating, your year and date of birth, etc. It could be through sort of your facial features, etc., etc. And the fortune teller that Ding Shi met was actually someone who could tell, who could read faces. And so when he met Ding Shi, he said, you're really special because I can see that you will not only pass the exams, but you'll be placed first. You'll be ranked first in the civil service examinations, which is a really great achievement. And this fortune teller said to him that, I can tell just from your face, but obviously it means that you've accumulated this good fortune or merits in your previous life and in the past. So, Ding Shi is very happy. A few years later, he runs into the same fortune teller. And, in these examinations, they didn't occur every year. So you'd often have to wait a few years to attend the next examination cycle. So this is, again, before his exams, and he meets the same fortune teller. But this time, the fortune teller is really shocked. He sees Ding Shi, and he says, actually, you're very different from how you were last time. I can see that good fortune. You no longer will be able to pass the exams. What's happened in your life? What have you done? Now, as a scholar, Ding Shi is also, he's read these texts. He knows the various Confucian and Taoist traditions, and that principle of divine retribution, the principle of cause and effect. And he sort of immediately reflects on his activities. And he tells the truth. He tells this fortune teller that actually recently I was involved in, some scam. And as a result of that, I earned, about $6 million. So that was not something that sort of went against my conscience. And the fortune teller says, yes, that's exactly it. And that's why your fortune has changed. Now, Ding Shi was very intelligent, but clearly he used his intelligence for the wrong reasons, for criminal activity. So he originally had the good fortune and intelligence to be able to be placed first in the examinations. But then, he used this, his clever thinking to squander someone else's property, this particular misdeed. But he realizes his mistake and he feels really regretful. So what he does is he tries as soon as possible to return that money to its rightful owner and apologizes. And, in the hopes that he won't be punished and that he will ultimately pass the exams. Now, what happens to him? Well, he does pass the exams, but in the very long list of candidates who pass the exams, his name is really at the very bottom. In other words, he's only just made it. And he certainly hasn't come top or is certainly not placed first in the examinations. Now, this, if we analyze it a bit, Ding Shi originally had the good fortune to come first. Okay, now, this good fortune of coming first is not just a rank. Being placed first would mean that you would be employed in a very high-level position in the government, have a very good salary, prestige, power, authority, and ultimately a very good career ahead. Your whole family probably would not need to worry about working because your salary and your connections would be enough. But because he had committed this misdeed, the very misdeed that we're discussing here, cheating others of their property for himself, he sort of swapped his good fortune. Getting $6 million from someone is not something that's very easy. And if he hadn't had the good fortune of, getting a top place, top position in government, he probably would not have been able to scam someone. He probably would have been, thrown into jail even before he could, the money came into his bank account. So he ultimately took his good fortune and swapped it for this $6 million. And in the process, yes, he attained the $6 million, but in the process lost much more. He lost his position, he lost that good fortune, and, as the fortune teller said, the second time we saw him, probably would not have made it in the examinations, which would have meant, life not as an official, probably some other, low-level clerkship or work, but certainly not in the top ranks of government or with a good salary. So he sort of sold off or swapped that good fortune for this scam or this this particular fraudulent activity. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that it doesn't stop there, because you can see that Ding Shi, is very clever. He realizes that he will suffer from his misdeed, and he feels regret, he feels guilty, and he makes amends, right? He returns what he stole. And ultimately, he changes his fortune again. He changes his destiny. But you can see that it's already, his good fortune's already been depleted. By changing his fortune, he's able to then achieve a place, pass the exams, but now it's not as good as what it was before. Now, yes, he's probably able to attain a government position, but nothing like, being placed first. The prestige, the power, authority, and the salary of coming first in that career. So ultimately, you can see the change in one's fortunes, and it's all dependent on ourselves, our conduct, which can be boiled into 3 different categories: physical conduct, verbal conduct, and mental conduct. So our actions, words, and our thoughts, which drive everything we say and do. So Venerable Master Ching Kung, in his lecture, explains that, how does this particular misdeed relate to us? It relates to us because most of us don't realize how to really grow and develop our good fortune. And in fact, our lives, we waste our good fortune. We waste it to the extent that, you see a lot of people in their old age being, bedridden, or their health really suffers. They can't live independently, but at the same time, no one wants to live with them. None of their family wants to take care of them. And they're facing financial difficulties as well as, health problems. And yes, you could say that the government tries to have some aged care services, tries to look after the elderly, but that's very little as to what really needs to be done to care for these people. It's really just the bare minimum. So Venerable Master asks the question, which is, how do we actually solve this problem? How do we address this problem fundamentally? And the answer is education. Educating people on how to look after, to develop, to grow their good fortune. In the same way as we might think of, growing our wealth, growing our savings, and to educate particularly our children from a very young age to develop these good habits, to develop the habit of what we might call counting our blessings. Now, in Chinese, this is pronounced as Si Fu, and I've broken down the characters so you can sort of get the full sort of meaning of these words. To see, the first character, is to treasure, to really cherish our blessings, everything in our lives that would be favorable, harmonious relationships, etc., our good fortune, so to speak, our happiness. So yes, it can be translated in a way as to count your blessings, but I think it's more than that. It's not just counting our blessings, but it's about how to preserve them, so that you don't waste it, that you've always got your savings there, but also to grow them and to really care for our blessings. So if we have, if both our parents are still alive, if we have good relationships with siblings, if we have siblings, then it's not just about taking advantage of our good relations, and using our siblings to help us whenever we need, or our family members, but actually to care for them. This is having a good family members, healthy family members. This is a blessing. And we don't just simply appreciate and be grateful to them, but we actually have to care for them in return. And that is how we grow this good fortune, these blessings. And part and parcel of it, at a very fundamental level, is to live sparingly, to what we might call sustainable living today, to ensure that it's not just our good fortune, but it's part of looking after the environment. And it's all because it's all too easy in a developed country, with good infrastructure, communications, facilities, etc., to just take things for granted. And at a very, very basic, the most basic level, is to teach children to take care of their belongings, to take care of their environment and the things around them. So in the ancient primers, things like deeds of Gui, etc., you might have heard of, they were designed to teach children about how to look after their belongings, to take care of things. And this is before they even thought about, how to, get along with others and really care for the people around them. The first thing is to care for what they have. Okay, so Zhu, who lived in the 12th century, it's pictured here, was, you could say, a pioneer in elementary education in Chinese history. He really sort of brought to the forefront the importance of educating children in this way of looking after themselves and their good fortune. And he wrote something for young children called a very short, essay, you'd say, a primer, which was called Required Knowledge for Children. And this is something that all children should know. It was divided into just 5 sections. You can see here very clearly, the first part is about looking after your clothes. It's probably the first things that we have in our lives is our clothes. And even young children, babies, toddlers, infants, they have to wear clothes. So, when we want to start looking after something, we start by the things that are closest to us, the first things that we have, our belongings, and that's our clothing. So that's the very first section. And talks about us, how to speak to others in a polite way, to care for others, etc. 3 is cleaning, so ensuring that our environment is clean and tidy. Reading and writing, so all children have to learn literacy. Reading and writing is next, and the 5th section was sort of miscellaneous items. Now, I want to sort of hone in on the first section. Okay, so taking out the first section, it's very short, and you can see I've translated the Chinese and the various different items that Zhu has listed out. And he begins by saying, one's character. So this is something that children should start thinking about from a very, very young age. They have to develop good character. So how to be a good person begins with, very simply, your physical appearance, and how neat and tidy you are. And this is important as a child because really they don't have a job yet, they're not studying, they may or may not have friends when they're very young, but they need to know how to look after themselves before they look after their studies, their work, and their friends and their family, right? So they need to look after themselves, their physical health and their appearance. So it begins by talking about, your everything, your cap. People in those days would wear hats, socks and shoes, etc. They have to be properly placed and they have to be tidy. It's interesting in the second point when it talks about how there are 3 areas that have to be firmly fastened: the hair, the waist, and socks. Might have to explain that a bit. In the past, both women and men had long hair, and it had to be tied back. It wasn't sort of left out. And people in the past also wore long garments. So they were often sort of fastened at the waist with a sash or a belt. They also wore long socks. He mentions that these 3 areas of the body, our clothing, have to be tightened because, I'm sure everyone has had the experience of wearing loose socks or loose trousers. It doesn't feel very comfortable. But also, on top of that, it makes you feel untidy and, not formal. And so, therefore, it sort of affects and influences your attitude. Sort of, when you've just woken up, your hair's in a mess. But, when you comb it, when you put on your work clothes or your uniform if you go to school, then you place yourself in a different mood. And that's what he's trying to get at here, that as children, even if you have your children's clothes, you need to know how to wear it properly. You need to ensure that it's well fitted. And therefore, that helps your attitude to life in general. Then the idea of, when you're wearing your clothes, you have to think about your clothes when you're doing things, like when you're eating or you're walking. When you're eating, your sleeves shouldn't get dirtied. When you're walking, try not to walk in puddles or muddy areas because then that dirties your clothes. So actually, the idea of even looking after your clothes makes you think about, or makes the child think about, how they should eat, how they should walk, where they should walk. And it also helps to think about protecting themselves. So that's just when you're wearing a clothes. When you take off your clothes, you shouldn't just, throw it on the ground, throw it in a pile, because that will mean that it's much easier to, develop wear and tear, right? Buttons might fall off, with children's clothes, etc. So the children should be taught, or as he said here, to fold the clothes and to put them in the right place. Store them correctly. It doesn't have to be with other clean clothes because you've just worn these clothes, but it should be placed in a proper area rather than just on the ground. If there are any sort of tears or holes, then that should be mended. A stitch in time saves 9. So, something that we need to think about, or we need to teach our children, that if they see anything, a hole or a tear or something, then they need to tell us, and they, perhaps as a parent or as an older sibling, we can help them mend it. And if it has been mended, then that's a good thing. We shouldn't worry that our clothes are old, but that as long as they're neat and tidy, that's the most important thing. And you can see the rest of the points are in a similar fashion, reminding children to look after their belongings, their clothes, in the very first instance. And, that helps them think about more than just themselves. As a child, it's very easy to just think about, okay, I want this, I want that, I want to go here. But if you think about looking after your clothes, then that changes things. And these clothes, yes, they are yours, but it's also because your parents bought them for you. And, you can think about, like, there are various ways that the parent or the teacher can explain that actually these clothes, yes, your parents may have bought it from you from the shops, but who actually sewed them together? Have you ever sewn clothes? Have you ever, put together clothes yourselves? That whole process is not something that's very easy, etc., etc. Maybe when they're older to explain these things. And they will therefore live in a way that's more sustainable, not only financially, but also for the planet. So, these days, of course, looking after your clothes is not just simply, when people think about one's character here, as it says, but actually for the environment. If you look after your clothes as a child, then perhaps when you've grown out of them, you can give it to younger siblings. Or if you don't have younger siblings, to be able to donate it to the nearest op shop or charity. And interestingly, if you can't donate it for some reason, maybe it's quite stained, it's not very wearable anymore, that clothing, that fabric can be used for other things. For example, it could be used as a multi-purpose cloth, cleaning cloth. It could be used to clean various surfaces around the house. And, and it can be continued to be cleaned and laundered. If it no longer serves the purpose of being used to clean tabletop surfaces or benches, then maybe it can be used to clean the floor. It can be a floor rag or a floor cloth within the house. If it can no longer be used to clean the floor, because maybe it's too stained, then what about using it as an outdoor rag? When you're gardening and your hands are muddy and you need something to wipe your hands with after you've washed it down, maybe you could use that as an outdoor cloth, or even when you're doing things with the car or in the garage, you can use these as rags. So you can see that the life cycle of a particular piece of clothing is actually can be used for many different purposes. If you look after it well, you can donate it, and someone else can use it as a shirt or as trousers or whatever in its original function. But if it can no longer be used as clothing, it can be used for cleaning. And, in different areas of the house, at different grades. So I've been very fortunate that my parents have had these very good sustainable habits. And in our household, we have various grades of rags. So you have, as I mentioned, rags or cloths for cleaning surfaces, for cleaning the floors, and for outdoor purposes that may not be the most cleanest, are used for the outdoor cleaning. And in that way, this material is not wasted. That you can have, if you look after this cleaning cloth, it can be used for decades. And you can use it in various areas of the house, as I mentioned. Similarly, there's the idea of saving paper, and I think that this is something that whether you're at school or in an office environment, is something that is not new to us. Just to hone in on this, obviously the very first part of the entire cycle is to think about, do I need to print this out? Do I need to waste that paper? If you ultimately print it out, like the photo on the right-hand side, and you have a lot of documents, what happens if you finish using those documents? So, for example, you've printed something out for oral presentation. You've made the presentation, you no longer need to keep this speech as for your records. Then what do you do with that? Well, most people would think about just throwing it in the recycle bin. But what if you've printed it only on one side? Then maybe you would use the reverse side as scrap paper to jot down notes for your next presentation or something else. Or if you've printed on two sides, but maybe there's a part of that paper that is still quite blank that you can actually use. And you can create your own note paper. So, note paper can come in various sizes depending on, how much of that paper is left. You can have big pieces of note paper, small pieces of note paper that you can use to sort of jot down things like a shopping list or reminders for yourself or reminders for others. That, every part of that piece of paper can be used. And I've even put a photo of an envelope here because, sometimes when you get snail mail or even junk mail, the envelopes, if you can't reuse them as an envelope, you can reuse them as note paper. So, the different parts of the envelope, the back or the front, does have blank space, and you can use that as note paper. So every part of, even a sheet of paper, if you can think about using it more than one way, then this is, the baby steps, the first steps to really living sustainably. And if you can save even a sheet of paper, you're thinking, oh, how much does a sheet of paper cost? Well, actually not very much, but if everyone thinks that way, then you can see the cost to the overall cost to the environment. So if we can start with, saving paper, looking after clothes, or at least teach the younger generation, our children, to do so, then you're already starting them on these very good habits towards sustainable living and towards really counting their blessings and really caring for their blessings and their good fortune. The other thing that Venerable Master explains in this particular lecture for this sentence is that we have to be very careful when it comes to objects or materials from or the belongings of a temple or a way place. And, it could even be said that, charities or sort of not-for-profit organizations, you have to be very careful if you living there, for example, in a temple, or you are working there. So based on the Buddhist tradition, if you take something without someone's permission and you use it, then that is considered stealing. So that's the basic definition. So before you use anything, you should try to ask the responsible person. Now, if you don't ask and you end up using the book or the paper or whatever, generally you would be considered so-called stealing from one person because that paper belongs to one person. If you take something that is public property for the general public, then actually your debtors would be every citizen in that country. And so let's say you damage some public property. Well, who pays for that? The taxpayers. So all the citizens who are providing taxes that allows the government to be able to repair and build infrastructure. If we damage any of that, then and we don't find a way to fix the problem, then we are in debt to all the taxpayers in that country. Now, back to the concept of the way place or the temple. If we think about it, who provides the funds for that religious institution? Oftentimes, it's the donors. And the donors can come from all walks of life, from all around the world. And essentially, that money is for all of these belongings, whether it's books, actual property, etc., is for the benefit of all sentient beings. So by taking something, actually you owe a debt to all sentient beings across time and space. So the demerit or the misdeed is actually far worse than any, taking the same book or piece of paper from anywhere else. Now, this is not related to books that are for free distribution or circulation, like sutra books or something like that. Obviously, they are for, it's meant to be given out for free. But I'm talking about, if you happen to work there or live there in this way place and you damage something or you use things without, in a wasteful way, then the demerits accumulated from that, based on the fact that it is a temple, is going to be far worse than doing the same thing in your work or at home. And that's because of who actually the property of that temple is for all sentient beings. So so we have to be doubly careful when we are in these particular institutions, whether it's a temple, any other religious institution, and even a charity, because these are, the charities are run, and all the resources come from its donations. So I think that is something that we have to be particularly mindful of in that circumstance. So that's that idea of squandering someone else's property, and how it relates to our everyday life is to think about how to live sparingly, to live sustainably, and to really preserve and care for the good fortune and the blessings that we have, whether it's our property, our belongings. As I said, children start learning by looking after the things that they have in their lives before you start to think about the more abstract things like our relationships, our work, our study, etc. And if you have that very good attitude towards your own property, towards your own good fortune, then you certainly wouldn't be thinking about squandering someone else's property, someone else's good fortune, because you already are very mindful of your own. So when you come back to this misdeed, it's not just about, do not do something, but it's actually thinking about the flip side of it, which is to do something, which is, what do we have to do here? If we don't, obviously we try not to, and we avoid squandering someone else's property. But what do? Is we have to really be conservative and sparing in the use of our own property. We know how to care for ourselves, then we know how to care for others. So that's that particular line. Then the next line is to cause divisions in someone else's family. So, even from a word-by-word breakdown, it's not very difficult to understand. In the collected commentaries, this idea of separating or dividing can be through the result of two main processes. The first is collecting debts to such an urgent extent that, the person has to divide their family, or, causes separation in the family because you've taken all their funds and they're destitute. The second one is probably more common, is to cause division by driving a wedge between family members through your actions or your words. And, clearly, if that's what we shouldn't do, but what we should do is that if we see any conflict between siblings, between spouses, between partners, or even, between members of an extended family, if we are in a kind of trusted position, if we have some sort of authority, if people are willing to listen to us, then we have to use that to try to create harmony, to try to build a bridge between those people. So you may have friends who come to you, complaining about their family members, whether it's their siblings or even extended family. But most of the time, the best thing is to advise them on, how they can rectify the situation from their perspective. What have they done that might have caused that kind of attitude? If they think that they've done nothing, well, maybe they can do more or something. And to sort of encourage them along that line, encourage them towards greater generosity, spirit, tolerance, forbearance, and ultimately greater harmony. It's very interesting in the collected commentaries. There's this story from the Song dynasty, so in the 12th century, as you can see here. And, royal families, that the harmony in the royal family, the ruling family, is of utmost importance, because if there's disharmony, or if there's conflict, then everyone else, government, the people, will suffer. So in the story, Emperor Yingzong came to power. He was actually the nephew of the former ruler, Emperor Renzong, because the former ruler did not have any surviving sons. Now, the former ruler's wife, Empress Dowager Cao, who is pictured here, ultimately sort of filled in, because Emperor Yingzong had very chronic, debilitating conditions. And, as a result, he was not the best ruler in the sense that, physically he was unwell, but also he didn't have that leadership to be able to ensure that things in his court were run smoothly. As a result, people had grievances towards him, and they would, go to the Empress Dowager to air their grievances. And, to such an extent that the two sort of fell out, and, there was often disharmony. They didn't get along very well. The story is that, the two key sort of senior ministers of the time, named Han Qi and Ouyang Xiu, they were, you could say, the chancellors. And they came to report to the Empress Dowager because at the time she was making some of the decisions. And the Empress Dowager, tells them about her miseries or difficulties with Emperor Yingzong. Now, if these particular senior ministers wanted to gain an advantage for themselves, they might have said, well, let's do away with him. Let's try to get someone else. We will, serve you and, use that to achieve more authority. But they didn't do that. They tried to create harmony between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. And Han Qi particularly mentioned that the Emperor was unwell, that perhaps all of this is because he's just unwell, and maybe when he is better, when his condition improves, he will be in a better mood and be a better person. So they tried to sort of find excuses for the Emperor. Old Yangxiu, who was the other person in attendance at the time, took a different approach and tries to remind the Empress Dowager of her great virtue, the things that she's done in the past, her, great tolerance for others, and, how she should extend that to Yingzong. And Han Qi then chimes in by saying that, actually, if you think about it, Yingzong is really your nephew. His empress, his wife, is your niece, and one of the in this huge family, and they've grown up together with you. So you should just see them as your children, and really look after them and remind them of what they need to do. And so they try to sort of improve her mood by encouraging her in the right direction, which is that any family, particularly the ruling family, everyone has their weaknesses, and it's a matter of really trying to help each other out. But actually, Han Qi does even more. So a few days later, he goes and sees the Emperor Yingzong, and tells him about the Empress Dowager and the fact that she's done so much for him in his life. The fact that he could even rule was to a great extent because of the authority of the Empress Dowager that gave him his title and his position. So he really owes a debt of favor to her, and he should really think about how it is that he can show his and repay that kindness more. The emperor agrees because for so long he's just had a really bad relationship with her, and he wants to try to find a way out and try to find a better way of to improve the situation. So he tries to agree, but then a few days later Han Qi comes back and the emperor says, well, whatever I try to do, she's still very difficult and really tough. And, it's like nothing I can do will help. But then Han Qi continues by explaining that actually, if you look back at the great figures of Chinese history, like King Shun, these people didn't become great because they had favorable circumstances. It's so easy to love your parents if they love you and they do everything for you. But it's those people who love their parents who are difficult that really achieve the most because they develop their character. And particularly as the emperor, you provide that example to everyone in your government and the people. So he uses the example of King Shun and King Shun's story to really inspire the emperor to do more, to find more in himself, this inner strength to give back and to think of the Empress Dowager in a way that will improve their relationship. And so, these very difficult days and that relationship itself could have been much worse. And many different ministers and officials tried to find ways to take advantage of the situation, to, create factions and sides, so that they could gain promotion and advancement. But you can see that Han Qi and Ouyang Xiu in this particular historical account, they didn't do that. They tried to create harmony. And that's the thing about this particular sentence in the 太上感應篇, is that we learn about these misdeeds, which is creating division, but we also learn about the good deed, which is how we can create and accumulate merit and good fortune by helping others through tough times with their family. And that's something that all of us will have, difficulties, differences of opinions. It's about finding ways around that, because at the end of the day, your family. So this is something that, we can help people. If people come to us and complain and have, want to air their feelings, then this is something that we can do very easily to help them think through it and to encourage them in different ways, just like these ministers did for the emperor and the empress dowager. So that's all we have time for today. We've covered the 2 sentences in the Exalted Treatise. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.